Hey Adam, back again. Today I'm gonna be reading two stories, um, for obvious reasons, of course. So, let me scooch it back a bit there. Hopefully since it's gonna be longer, I gotta read like a whole 100 pages. Yeah, hopefully this really does, obviously. Alright. In the beginning, Bartholomew Cubbins didn't have 500 hats. Hold on, let me make sure. Yeah, the name of the book is The 500 Hats of Bartholomew Cubbins. Alright, so in the beginning, Bartholomew Cubbins didn't have 500 hats. He had only one hat. It was an old one that had belonged to his father and his father's father before him. It was probably the oldest and plainest hat in the whole kingdom of Did, where Bartholomew Cubbins lived. But Bartholomew liked it, especially because of the feather that always pointed straight up in the air. The kingdom of Did was ruled by King Derwin. His palace stood high on top of the mountain. From his balcony, he looked down over the house of all his subjects. First, I can't read. From his balcony, he looked down over the houses of all his subjects first, over the spires of the nobleman's castle, across the broad Sorry, this is like a complete change of pace, but the cat's out again. Yeah. I'm gonna try and tame that cat. We've been over this. So, if I can, I'll try and make a cat video too. Sorry. First, over the spires of the noblemen's castles, across the broad roofs of the rich men's mansions, then over the little houses of the townsfolk, to the huts of the farmers far off in the fields. It was a mighty view, and it made King Derwin feel mighty important. Far off in the fields, on the edge of a cranberry bog, stood the hut of the Cubbins family. From the small door, Bartholomew looked across the huts of the farmers to the houses of the townsfolk, then to the rich men's mansions and the noblemen's castles, up to the great towering palace of the king. It was exactly the same view that King Derwin saw from his balcony, but Bartholomew saw it backwards. It was a mighty view, but it made Bartholomew Cubbins feel mighty small. Just after sunrise one Saturday morning, Bartholomew started for the town. He felt very happy. A pleasant breeze whistled through the feather in his hat. In his right hand, he carried a basket of cranberries to sell at the market. He was anxious to sell them quickly and bring the money back home to his parents. He walked faster and faster till he got to the gates of the town. The sound of silver trumpets rang through the air. Hoofbeats clattered on the cobbled streets. Horses. Clear the way, make way for the king. All the people rushed for the sidewalks. They drove their carts right up over the curbstones. Bartholomew clutched his basket tighter. Around the corner dashed 50 trumpeters on yellow-robed horses. Behind them, on crimson-robed horses, came the king's own guards. "Hats off to the king," shouted the captain of the king's own guards. On came the king's carriage, white and gold and purple. It rumbled like thunder through the narrow street. It swept past Bartholomew. Then suddenly, its mighty brakes shrieked. It lurched and then it stopped. The whole procession stood still. Bartholomew could hardly believe what he saw. Through the side window of the carriage, the king himself was staring back, straight back at him. Bartholomew began to tremble. "Back up," the king commanded the royal coachman. The royal coachman shouted to the royal horses. The king's own guards shouted to the crimson-robed horses. The trumpeters shouted at their yellow-robed horses. Very slowly, the whole procession backed down the street until the king's carriage stopped right in front of Bartholomew. The king leaned from his carriage window and fixed his eyes directly on Bartholomew Cubans. Well, he demanded. Bartholomew shook with fright. "I ought to say something." He thought to himself, but he couldn't think of nothing to say. "Well?" demanded the king again. "Do you or do you not take off your hat before the king?" "Yes, indeed, sire," answered Bartholomew, feeling greatly relieved. "I do take off my hat before my king." "Then take it off this very instant," commanded the king more loudly than before. "But, sire, my hat is off," answered Bartholomew. "Such impudence," shouted the king, shaking an angry finger. "How dare you stand there and tell me that your hat is off?" "I don't like to say you're wrong, sire," said Bartholomew very politely, "but you see my hat is off." And he showed the king the hat in his hand. "If that's your hat in your hand," demanded the king, "what's that on your head?" "On my head?" gasped Bartholomew. There did seem to be something on his head. He reached up his hand and touched a hat. There's a picture of him with 3 hats now. How much is this? 500? 220? The face of Bartholomew Cubbins turned very red. "It's a hat, sire," he stammered, "but it can't be mine. Someone behind me must have put it on my head." "I don't care how it got there," said the king. You take it off." And the king sat back in his carriage. Bartholomew quickly snatched off the hat. He stared at it in astonishment. It was exactly the same as his own hat, the same size and same color, and it had the exactly the same feather. "By the crown of my fathers," roared the king, again leaning out of the carriage window, "did I or did I not command you to take off your hat?" "You did, sire. I took it off. I took it off twice." "Nonsense. There is still a hat upon your head." "Another hat?" Again Bartholomew reached up his hand and touched a hat. Come. What is the meaning of all of this?" demanded the king, his face purple with rage. "I don't know, sire," answered Bartholomew. "It never happened to me before." The king was now shaking with such fury that the carriage rocked on its wheels, and the royal coachman could hardly sit in his seat. "Arrest this impudent trickster," shouted the king to the captain of the king's own guards. "We'll teach him how to take off his hat." The royal coachman cracked his long whip. The king's carriage swung forward up the street towards the palace. But the captain of the king's own guards leaned down from his big brass saddle and grabbed Bartholomew Cubbins by his shirt. Away flew Bartholomew's basket. The cranberries bounced over the cobbled stones and rolled down into the gutter. With a jangling of spurs and a clatter of horseshoes, the captain and Bartholomew sped up the winding street towards the palace. Out of the narrow streets, on up the hill, Bartholomew clung to the captain's broad back. On and on they galloped, past the bright gardens of the wealthy merchants, higher and higher up the mountain, on past the walls of the noblemen's castles. Flip. The sharp wind whisked off Bartholomew's hat. Flip, flip. Two more flew off. Flip, flip, flip. Flew another. And another. 4, 5, 6, 7. Bartholomew kept counting as the hats came faster and faster. Sorry. Lords and ladies started from the windows of their turrets, wondering what the strange stream of the hats could mean. Over the palace drawbridge they sped through the great gates into the courtyard. The captain pulled in his reins. "His Majesty waits in the throne room," said the guard, saluting the captain. "The throne room?" The captain dropped Bartholomew to the ground. "I'd certainly hate to be in your shoes," he said, shaking his head sadly. For a moment, Bartholomew was terribly frightened. Still, he thought to himself, the king can do nothing dreadful to punish me, because I really haven't done anything wrong. It would be cowardly to feel afraid. Bartholomew threw back his shoulders and marched straight ahead into the palace. "Follow the black carpet," said the guard at the door. All through the long hallway, Bartholomew could hear the muttering of voices behind heavy doors. "He won't take off his hat?" "No, he won't take off his hat." Bartholomew walked on till he stood in the very middle of the throne room. The king, in a long scarlet robe, was sitting on his throne. Beside him stood Sir Alaric, keeper of the king's records. He wore in his belt, instead of a sword, a long silver ruler. He wore in his belt, instead of a sword, a long silver ruler. Lords and noblemen of the courtyard stood solemn and silent. The king looked down at Bartholomew severely. "Young man, I'll give you one more chance. Will you take off your hat for the king?" "Your Majesty," said Bartholomew as politely as he possibly could. "I will, but I'm afraid it won't do any good." And he took off his hat, and it didn't do any good. Another hat sat on Bartholomew's head. He took off hat after hat, after hat, after hat, after hat, after hat, until he was standing in the middle of a great pile of hats. The lords and the noblemen were so astonished they couldn't even speak. Such a thing had never happened in the throne room before. "Heavens," said Sir Alaric, keeper of the records, blinking behind his triangular spectacles. "He's taken off 45. "And there were 3 more down in the town," said the king. "And you must add on 87 more that blew off my head as we galloped up the hill," said Bartholomew, trying to be helpful. 135 hats. "Most unusual," said Sir Alaric, writing it down on a long scroll. Come, said the king impatiently. "Sir Alaric, what do you make of this nonsense?" "Very serious nonsense, your Majesty," answered Sir Alaric. "I advise you to call in an expert on hats." "Excellent," agreed the king. "Ho guard, fetch in Sir Snips, maker of hats for all the fine lords." Into the throne room marched the smallest man wearing the tallest hat that Bartholomew had ever seen. It was Sir Snips it was Sir Snips. Instead of a sword, he wore at his side a large pair of scissors. "Take a look at this boy's hat," commanded the king. Sir Snips looked at Bartholomew Cubbins' hat and sniffed in disgust. Then he turned to the king and bowed stiffly. "Your Majesty, I, Sir Snips, am the maker of hats for all the fine lords. I make hats of cloth and gold, fine silks and gems, and ostrich plumes. You ask me what I think of this hat? Poor! It is the most ordinary hat I've ever set eyes on." "In that case," said the king, "it should be very simple for you to take it off." "Simple indeed," mumbled Sir Snips haughtily. And standing on his tippy toes, he pushed his pudgy thumb at Bartholomew's hat and knocked it to the floor. Immediately, another appeared on Bartholomew's head. "Screebies!" screamed Sir Snips, leaping in the air higher than he was tall. Then he turned and ran shrieking out of the throne room. "Dear me," said the king, looking very puzzled. "If Snips can't do it, this must be more than an ordinary hat." 136, wrote Sir Alaric, wrinkling his brow. "Your Majesty, I advise you call in your wise men." "A fine idea," said the king. "Oh, guard! Bring me Nad. Nad knows about everything in all my kingdom." In came an old man. He looked at the hat on Bartholomew's head, and he looked at the pile of hats on the floor. "Nad, my wise man, can you take off his hat?" asked the king. Nad shook his head solemnly. "No." "Then fetch me the father of Nad," commanded the king. "He knows about everything in all my kingdom, and in all the world beyond." In came an even older man, but when he looked at Bartholomew's hats, the father of Nad merely locked his fingers across his beard and said nothing. "Then bring me the father of Nad," ordered the king. "He knows about everything in the kingdom and in all the world beyond, and in all other worlds that may happen to be." Then came the oldest man of them all, but he just looked at Bartholomew and nibbled nervously at the end of his beard. "Does this mean there is no one in my whole kingdom who can take off this boy's hat?" bellowed the king in a terrifying voice. A small voice came up through the balcony window. "What's the matter, Uncle Darwin?" To Bartholomew, it sounded like the voice of a boy. The king stepped out on the balcony and leaned over the marble railing. "There's a boy in here, just about your age," the king said. "He won't take off his hat." Bartholomew tiptoed up behind the king and looked down. There stood a boy with a big lace collar, a very proud little boy, with his nose in the air. It was the Grand Duke Wilfred, nephew of the king. "You send him down here," said the Grand Duke Wilfred. "I'll fix him." The king thought for a minute. He pushed back his crowd and scratched his head. "Well, maybe you can. There's no harm trying." "Take him to the Grand Duke Wilfred," commanded the king, and two of the king's own guards led Bartholomew out of the throne room. "Poor," said the Grand Duke Wilfred, looking at Bartholomew's hat and laughing meanly. That hat won't come off? You stand over there." He pointed to the corner where the wall curved out. "They're on a balcony." Yeah, okay, so he's standing on the edge of a balcony, right? Really high up in the air. Just so you could get the picture in your head. Stand over there. He pointed to a corner where the wall curved out. I need a little target practice with my bow and arrow. When Bartholomew saw that Grand Duke Wilfred had only a child's bow, he didn't feel frightened. He spoke up proudly. I can shoot with my father's big bow. My bow's plenty big enough for shooting hats, especially hats like yours, answered Wilfred. And he let fly an arrow. Zzz. Is that the noise arrows make? Hold up. Zzz. Alright, yeah, sure, I'll accept that's the noise the arrows make. Is that okay with you? I mean, are you fine with that? If it's inaccurate, zzz, zzz. That's the noise they make. Sorry, I need to get this right. It grazed Bartholomew's forehead and nipped off his hat. Away it blew, and over the parapet. But another hat appeared on his head. The arrows flew, till the Grand Duke's whole bag full of arrows was gone, and still a hat sat upon Bartholomew's head. It's not fair, cried the Grand Duke. It's not fair. He threw down his bow and stamped upon it. 154 hats, gulped Sir Ulrich. These hats are driving me mad. The king's voice rang out through all the palace. Why waste time with a child's bow and arrow? Fetch me the mightiest bow and arrow in all my realm. Fetch the yeoman of the bowmen. Yeoman of the bowmen, echoed all the lords of the noblemen of court. A gigantic man strode out across the terrace. His bow was as big as the branch of a tree. The arrow was twice as long as Bartholomew, and thicker than his wrists. Yeoman of the bowmen, said the king, shoot off this boy's hat, and make it stay off. Bartholomew was trembling so hard that he could scarcely stand straight. The yeoman bent back his mighty bow. Hold up. I need to practice. That's the noise it makes. Like a mad giant hornet, the arrow tore through the air towards Bartholomew Cubbins. The sharp arrow head bit through his hat and carried it off, on and on for a full half mile. It plunked to a stop in the heart of an oak tree. Yet there on Bartholomew's head sat another hat. The face of the yeoman of the bowmen went white as the palace walls. It's black magic, he shrieked. Black magic? That's just what it is, sighed the king with relief. I should have thought of that before. That makes things simple. Back to the throne room. Call my magicians. In the whole throne room, there wasn't a sound as loud as a breath, but from the spiral stairs that led down from the southwest tower came the shuffling of slow, padded feet. The magicians were coming, low and slow. They were chanting words that were strange. Dig a hole 5 furlongs deep, down to where the night snakes creep. Mix and mold the mystic mud, Malber, Balber, Titter, Tud. In came seven black-gowned magicians, and beside each one stalked a lean black cat. They circled around Bartholomew Cubbins, muttering deep and mysterious sounds. "Stop this useless muttering," ordered the king. "I want a chant that will charm away this boy's hat." The magicians huddled over Bartholomew and chanted, "Winkabus tinkabus fortici clay, hat on this demon's head, fly far away. Howmen, howl away, howl away, howl away. Yell cats, yell away, yell away, yell away. Hat on this demon's head, seep away, creep away, leap away, gleep away. Never come back." "A mighty good chance," said the king, looking very pleased. "Are you sure it will work?" All the magicians nodded together. "But," said the king, looking puzzled, "there still seems to be a hat upon his head. How long will it take for the charm to work?" "Be calm, O sire, and have no fears," chanted the magicians. "Our charm will work in 10 short years." "10 years?" gasped the king. "Away, fools!" he shouted. "Out of my sight. I can't wait